So, hello everyone. I see people are coming in, participants. Let's just wait a bit more before we start our session today. Okay, I think we could already start with some welcome words because we have only 1 hour today. And of course, we want to make the most out of it. So first of all, a very welcome to both our speakers and the audience who are joining us today for our second roundtable, actually, in a mini event series, how we call it, on the topic of localization and the politics of humanitarian action. You might have joined us for your break, over your break, depending maybe also on your time zone. So please enjoy the discussion while having your lunch. You're welcome to do so. We also want to thank the IFHV for hosting this event as part of the Humanitarian Innovation webinar series of the research cluster Humanitarian Governance and Management. The IFHV, or Institute for International Law of Peace and Armed Conflict at the University of Bochum in Germany, is an interdisciplinary research institute and has a focus on humanitarian issues and studies. I myself am a senior researcher at the Institute, and with my own interest in the localization of humanitarian action, it is a particular pleasure to be here with you today. The event series, the 2 roundtables we're having, so this is the second one, grew out of a collaborative publication project on localization and the politics of humanitarian action, which I edited together with Kilian Spandler and Sulagna Maitra. Kilian is at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden and Sulagna Maitra at the University College Dublin, and they're both in the background here today as well. All the articles are now available as a research topic in Frontiers in political science, and I will post actually the link to the open access publications in the chat for your reference. So when you want to follow up on some of the readings and articles we're discussing. To the topic about localization. So at least since the World Humanitarian Summit, we could say localization has become a key concern of the humanitarian sector and has informed recent reform efforts. Very generally, maybe we could describe localization as the devolution of humanitarian tasks from international agencies to actors that are closer to the humanitarian situation, such as national and subnational authorities of affected states, local non-governmental organizations, community initiatives, and of course the affected population itself. While the idea of localization has reached near consensual status in global debates on humanitarian action, recent evaluations have concluded that its implementation remains a bit flawed and incomplete. So why has localization of humanitarian action remained stunted despite the broad rhetorical support? This is one of the questions, maybe the guiding question, that was the starting point of our publication project and informed already the discussion we had during our first event, in which we looked at the promises and pitfalls of localization. Today, we will focus on the question what it takes to make localization work. And we are very happy to have our authors here today to share their thoughts and insights from the research, but also experience in humanitarian action. Let me briefly introduce them to you. So we have first Ellen Goodwin. She's a PhD student at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and Alaistar Ager, who is the director of the Institute of Global Health and Development at Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh. From 2017 to 2020, he served also as Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor to the UK Department of International Development. Together with Ellen, he has written a piece in which they look at localization from a donor perspective, namely the United Kingdom. We also have here today Pat Gibbons. He's the director of the Centre for Humanitarian Action at the University College Dublin, and he has looked at localization from the perspective of Irish INGOs. And last but not least, of course, we have Hugo Slim from the University of Oxford, who, among other things, from 2015 to 2020 was head of policy at the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva, and has suggested in his opinion piece that localization is self-determination. Now, before we start our discussion with our authors today, just a few words of housekeeping. We will have a conversation among the authors of about 35 to 40 minutes before the audience is given the opportunity to ask questions through the Q&A function. And just to be aware of it, we're recording the session and it will be available afterwards on YouTube. So if you ask your questions, maybe indicate if you want to be mentioned by name or not. And I think Max, who's my colleague at the IFHV, has given you some instructions to use the chat, use the Q&A forum for an interactive session. Okay, so now let's start and get to the flesh of it. In our first short opening round, I want to ask our authors what we actually mean by localization. What do they mean by localization? What is localization to them? And I will start in the order I introduced you. So Ellen, how would you define localization?
So I think my approach to thinking about localization has come from the kind of global humanitarian reform agenda. And so against that backdrop, I see localization as a process by which the humanitarian sphere is shifting towards a vision of humanitarian action that is locally led. And so I'm aware that the kind of mechanisms through which we do this and kind of what the ongoing relationship between how we define international local actors going forward is kind of ambiguous in this definition. I'm sure we'll talk about some of those ambiguities today, but I think that there is this kind of normative process where we are reversing the flow of power and where the kind of norm of humanitarian action is that it's locally led with support from international actors.
Thank you, Ellen, very much for that. Alaistar, will give you immediately the floor.
Obviously, jointly working with Ellen, very much share that view. I suppose the spin I would put on it is when you ask about what's my definition of localization, it's that realization of the plurality and the uncertainty and how this term is used by different constituencies to mean different things. And one of the things we were exploring in the paper was not only how that is understood at a local level and at a national level, but also at a donor level in terms of framing what localization means in terms of commitments to development assistance and particularly humanitarian spend. So a typical academic thing to say, but a realization that there's a lack of conceptualization, a lack of clarity around how the term is used, which the last discussion usefully began to explore.
Yeah, thank you very much. We definitely had a discussion on that where we also linked it to concepts like solidarity and other aspects. Now, Pat, what is your take on that?
Yeah, well, it's an extremely difficult term to define as such, but as a concept, I'd see it as the need to recognize, respect, and support local leadership and communities to meet the immediate needs of disaster-affected populations and to leave them in a better place to respond to future crises.
Okay, thank you. Hugo.
Thank you. So I come at it thinking, I mean, I look at the phenomenon of localization arising as a policy call and call for action. And therefore I see it as a pushback against aid that is too international, and I would say too imperial today, or colonial, if you like that expression. So for me, localization is actually the pushing for self-determination, political self-determination, the right of people in another state, in their own state as citizens, to determine the state, the society around them socially and economically and culturally. And therefore, I see it as a call and a right to humanitarian self-determination within a state where those citizens can organize their own humanitarian response to crisis that arises in their country.
Thank you very much. Well, from your contributions, we already see exactly what Alaistar said. We have like this vagueness of the concept. We have different understandings of localization around, and it seems a bit difficult to grasp. And Ellen, you, I think, purposefully used the term of locally led humanitarian action instead of local humanitarian action. Yeah, localization to emphasize the power aspect there. Yeah, like really handing over the power. And I think Hugo, what you said also now, it rings the same, goes along the same lines, that it's a shift of power we want to see maybe in the humanitarian sector, what we maybe said, devolution or self-determination, as you said. And maybe we can follow up on that now to link it back to your research and your papers and your contributions. And I will start with you, Hugo. You have a very interesting exercise now, a challenging one, that all of you give us in 2 sentences, in a nutshell, the argument or the main message of your contribution, your paper, that you want to share with us today. So Hugo, I think you already referred to your contribution on localization and self-determination. Maybe you can flesh this out a bit more and share with us what is your main message you want to give.
Yeah, thank you. So I think that my main message is quite simply that localization is not simply a challenge of a technocratic challenge of aid effectiveness. It's also a question of political justice around people's rights to self-determination in their own state and community. And I think my other message is that international aid agencies tend to, at the moment, exaggerate the necessity of international aid. And what we need to do is find a better balance between complementary international aid when it is important and necessary, and the primary right for locally led humanitarian aid. So I think that's probably the main message of my paper.
Thank you very much. You definitely excelled on the synopsis. Pat, what is the key takeaway from your paper?
I suppose it's the need to address the domineering traditions of the international aid community, as Hugo would have said. But at the core as well is that to recognize that localization is not without risk, and that this risk needs to be shared by all stakeholders. I think it's going to require change in the organizational strategic management of NGOs for them to fully embrace this localization agenda, how they engage, how they partner. And there's going to be risk. The risk is there, and this risk is going to have to be shared by all actors in the process.
Thank you very much, Pat. And I will give the floor to you now, Alaistar.
So I think for us, there were 3 elements to our analysis of barriers, particularly as we looked at the UK engagement with the localization agenda over the last decade or so. And I actually want to link them a little bit to what Pat and Hugo have said. So at one level, Hugo just said about it's not just a technical challenge. So there's a bit of a technical challenge which Pat's talking about in terms of risk, and just the logistical management of an NGO, of a budget, and how that's managed. Seems a very prosaic concern in the context of the broader political discussions we're having, but nonetheless, I think is really, really important. We saw there were conceptual barriers in terms of what's local and the plurality of the local and the plurality of the agendas, which Hugo's paper explores a little bit in the dialectic within states in terms of representation of that. And then the third barrier, which is interesting, I suppose, our particular focus is on the donor rather than the aid agency. It's the donor's agenda to support humanitarianism in a particular way, and in particular tracking over a 10-year period how the UK position changed. And I think writing for a journal of political science was attractive for us in terms of seeing that as a deeply political process, not just about high government and the difference between the Cameron administration and the May administration, the Johnson administration, but the role of public opinion in that process in terms of development spend and humanitarian spend from the UK public. So really seeing those publics and the government political position as being hugely influential in how localization was interpreted, and in a sense, a backtracking on some of the principles in the Humanitarian Emergency Response Review, for example, of the coalition government. So at least three sorts of barriers, but very, very different types of barriers needing very, very different sorts of solutions.
Okay, thank you. Ellen, you were a co-author in this article, so do you want to add something to that?
Yes, I think Alaistar summed it up pretty well, and we're lucky that we have 2 attempts to sum up our article. But I guess kind of quite a broad take of our review through the examination of policies and practices of DFID was that this kind of, and we see this more broadly in the literature as well, but that while DFID has been quite vocal in their support of and commitments to localization in general, we identified kind of a real lack of progress or advance in practice based on these commitments. And we, as Alaistar has already highlighted, identified 3 kind of principal constraints around progress, and I'm sure we'll talk about them more, but yeah.
Yes, actually we will indeed, because what you already say now, I can hear lots like, you know, there seems to be an issue of power here, yeah? And like, you know, yeah, it's not only a technocratic thing, as Hugo said, but there's more involved. It's very highly political, as you just said, and there are more, as Pat said, risks involved. Maybe you can flesh this out a bit more, what kind of risks and to whom, and also, you know, why is the implementation lacking? Yes, it's political, but what are really the obstacles? We discussed it already in the first roundtable, but we have also different case studies here now. It would be interesting to hear also from different perspectives, because your paper, Alan and Alaistar, it was a donor's perspective, yeah? And this is maybe also a different perspective from, let's say, the INGOs that you studied, Pat, or the overall picture, Hugo, you have in mind. Now, looking at this, I would like to ask you, what would you be your, let's say, main critique or your main assessment of how NGOs or the actors involved, maybe also the donors, are approaching localization at the moment? Because we see this as lacking implementation, as you just mentioned, Alan. So what is it? And this time I will start with you, Pat. Would you agree with that assessment, this lack, and what would you be your critique of NGO practices at the moment?
Well, I suppose, Kristina, first of all, I'd say that, and we see a lot of the talk, and I was listening to the last webinar as well, and they seem to think that INGOs are a homogeneous grouping, but they're really very, very different. And why they all might sign up to the principles. Alongside these principles, these INGOs have values. And their values can be, and the importance they give to values can be quite different with regard to how they align and how they trust with their respective organizations or partner organizations in affected countries. I remember Dennis talked a lot about especially religious organizations and the strong trust that exists there, and the notion of social justice. And often localization sits very easy with such organizations compared to Hugo's last organization. Maybe Donantis might have a different perspective with regard to how they align or the relationship building. But at the same time, I'd like to take it even back to what I think Hugo was talking about, the domineering. I think it's easy for us to hit on INGOs. I'm looking around this screen and I'm seeing a lot of academics. And we're very slow to give that respect and recognition to our peers in these countries as well. And I think it's all about that relationship. I do think we have a lot to do, and in these fragile contexts, the relationship building and how we're working towards, I suppose, more meaningful respect and recognition and partnership to work along with organizations. And I think that's at the core of it, trying to overcome this these domineering traditions or tendencies of the international.
Thank you, Pat. Yeah, you also highlight a different perspective, like the academic one. Yeah, it's not only the INGOs. Hugo, what is your main?
So I would agree with what Pat's just said. I think if I was to put some critiques out at the moment, I would say there is more rhetoric than action on this subject. People are very happy to talk and promote the idea of localization very often on social media and show that they're doing, but actually I think we know, and Ellen and Alaistar's work shows that they're not really doing it. So I think I'd be a bit critical that most of them are avoiding the elephant in the room here for them as organizations. And for me, that is a dramatic change in business model will be required to really enable greater self-determination, as I would call it. And that really means changing big top-down aid institutions and NGOs and steering them away from their very individualistic model of humanitarian action, where they try and go around the world and find individuals in need, make lists of them, and then deal with each one of them, and actually shift them to a business model of humanitarian cooperation, where they are much more working as investing partners. And the other thing I would say that there is, there's the group Charter for Change and others who are making real efforts and have done for many years and driven a lot of this, and NEAR and others, to make that business model change. But I think a lot of the big ones, it's a terrifying prospect because they're going to have to make people redundant. They're going to have to change the way they work. And I think on the localizer side, as it were, I think there's probably an excessive claim of rights to localization at the moment, and not enough focus on their duties as humanitarian organizations. If they take on this self-determination approach, they need to show that they are really good and effective organizations and honest organizations, because they are not just working with a right to be humanitarian organizations, but with a duty to the communities around them to do that well. So I think we've got to get beyond sort of rhetoric and actually start looking at changing business models much more. And that takes courage and financial incentive to push people that way.
Talking about financial incentives, maybe we can look at the donor's perspective here. I mean, what do you say, like changing this business model, as Hugo said, do you think donors could play a role there? And how would you say, what is critical about the current, approach? Maybe Ellen, you would like to start. If not, Alaistar.
Yes, I think interestingly, from the donor's perspective, it's interesting to see aspects of kind of our finding kind of reflected actually in the practices of INGOs in Pat's piece, and also the kind of political angle that was explored by Hugo as well. And I think that I completely agree that there's kind of there's lots of rhetoric, and this was definitely something we identified in DFID, very strong commitments, kind of in the dialogue in the lead up to the World Humanitarian Summit. DFID was very vocal, and as a result, lots of their thinking is reflected in things like the grand bargain commitments, but we've seen kind of limited action, so lots of rhetoric and not action. And I think that this, to a large extent, is because of this kind of underlying conceptual ambiguity. We don't have the strategies and the mechanisms, even the definitions, any kind of broad consensus around those things. And as a result, I think this creates the kind of space in which, for donors in our case, but kind of more generally as well, my doctoral research looks at international faith-based organizations working with local faith actors. And I think we see that it creates this space for international actors to kind of localize and kind of embark on localization activities that kind of serve their own interests, and often that results in kind of picking the lowest hanging fruits, so to speak. So for example, a lack of consensus around who are the local often leads to quite a narrow engagement with who are local actors. So for DFID, for example, there was kind of consistent engagement with national governments and states, and they agree with the kind of diverse local, and we kind of highlight that this, for example, also is reflected in their kind of deep uncomfortableness with engaging with local faith actors, for example. And so I think underlying lots of this kind of lack of action is kind of a lack of kind of conceptual clarity, because there is a huge amount of kind of localization activities going on. For example, in my doctoral research, I see this with international faith-based organizations, but there's no kind of coordination, there's no knowledge sharing. And as a result, that kind of institutional knowledge is being kept within individual, and because they don't necessarily agree with localization, the terminology, they're using different kind of language. And so those discussions and knowledge sharing isn't happening either.
Could I pick up on that, Kristina, and link it back to, I think Hugo introduced some really valuable, the idea of financial incentives as a business model, and I want to pick up on that. But before touching on that, I think there's something that's reflected in Hugo's papers and Pat's and ours, which we probably all agree on, which is that there is stuff that happens at a local level. Hugo, you talk about the humanitarian self-determination already underway. So there are processes at a local level that we need to respect and we don't respect and we don't connect with. So there is something happening at the local level, irrespective of what international actors do. And it's something about the valorization and the promotion of that. So I don't think there's any disagreement in that. I think where then the challenge comes, if I'm sitting before a minister, from my own technical background, this is not an apologist for donors, the paper was being an academic that very much believes in the power of local action. When you're standing in front of a minister and you're trying to justify a resource transfer, a financial investment that somehow is a way that will bring benefits, not just to that context, but potentially benefits to the constituency of that minister. So what's the business model? We're talking about a resource transfer from north to south, from donors to the multilateral system or to the humanitarian system. What are the incentives for that being done? And I think a decade ago, the incentives were around building resilience, around a rule-based world order. And I think, Hugo, you're a little bit more optimistic than me that internationalism has survived and is reviving, whereas I feel still rather sick and uncertain about the fragmentation of donors and powerful states really investing in global public goods of solidarity and avoiding crisis in a way that doesn't just reinforce a securitization agenda. So for me, the challenge is, if we're both respecting the local, but not respecting it so much that we don't say there is still a major need for investment, for resource transfer from the rich north to situations of context, what's the deal there between justifying that transfer? And there are some liberal goals, I think, that very much underpin that long-term investment and that investment in local institutions, which is very much Paddy Ashdown's vision. But the language of investing UK taxpayers' money in local institutions outside of the power of UK government is nowhere near as fashionable in 2020 as it was in 2010. And we need to understand what's the case for that financial investment. And I think there's opportunities of doing that, but it really is around a rules-based system. It's around multilateralism and the real power of that. And as we fragment towards more bilateral action and understandings of that, I think we're undermining the sorts of humanitarian system that we got used to post-war as being this global response, a global solidarity, which we talked about a little bit a couple of weeks ago.
Thank you very much. Pat, I'm thinking, like, knowing of your experience also being involved in the Irish context, is it something, what Alice just said, that resonates with your experience with Ireland, like the INGOs you're working with, but also the government and the incentives that are needed?
Of course, I'm sorry, can you hear me? Yeah, of course that there is this notion of self-interest is there, but personally, I would even take it back. I remember when I met Hugo a long time ago, maybe 20 years ago, and we were talking at that time on humanitarian assistance and the whole need slowly but surely to engage with people has moved on considerably. But the humanitarian enterprise in 2022 is very different than it was in the 1990s. And there is a certain, I think it's often referred to as professionalism, this notion that organizations have to address and have to have policies aligned with their values. This idea of safeguarding, this idea of accountability, the idea of use of imagery. There's an awful lot of movement that has happened in the aid business. And I don't know, I'm hearing what Alaistar is saying, but sitting down, and I'm not an apologist for Irish aid, no more so than you, the British government, but I don't know, are they ready to pump money or to leave money over to organizations that maybe don't have this level of professionalism? And I think this is where the change business world is going to be. Rather than doing to or doing for people, INGOs are going to, I think, have to partner somewhere and work along with local partners and give them the wherewithal to try and engage more meaningfully with local organizations. Now, this notion of capacity strengthening, I think we have an awful lot to learn. If I could just bring you an example, localization is not just over there. When the Irish when COVID hit here, the whole notion was how we deal with local communities. And when we look back now, we'll see that it was the real effort, the real successes were by engaging with the local Gaelic Athletic Association, the local communities. These were the ones that had access to the people that were in their local areas. Similarly, and that's not even just at the community level, the more in the bigger Irish situation, we very much have adopted an approach with refugees. We took the international system and developed these reception centers, which are little more than prisons. The way we treat people is brutal. And now the local people are turning around to the Irish government and saying, we can't treat refugees like this. You know, like, so there's an awful lot more, go back to what Hugo said earlier on, a respect for the local cultures, the local ways of thinking, and I suppose the difference, the respect for different culture, different ways of doing things in these countries.
Kristina, can I just come in a quick example there and
Yes.
then throw it out? So, and it links, I'm really glad that Pat raises, because it sounds quite prosaic in terms of accountability, but in Irbid in Jordan, in discussing with local NGOs, there was this discussion of how there's ensuring that non-food items are equitably distributed, and there was an NGO with a Western expert running a spreadsheet to ensure and ticking things off to ensure that there was an equitable distribution of aid. And it was pointed out that the local imam could much more efficiently stand at the door of the mosque and make sure that it was done fairly, much more cheaply than this subcontractor managing an Excel spreadsheet. But the aid organization couldn't cope with that local respect and authority. It had to have some, however inefficient it was, it felt it had to rely on an expatriate completed Excel spreadsheet. And it just seems in microcosm there that we know at a local level that's ludicrous. We know that there's local power, there's local authority that we should be able to trust. But down the long chain of intolerable fiduciary risk, the Excel spreadsheet that it creates an elite that has the laptop and then can maintain it, and it wins out in that. So although it sounds a very prosaic example, I think that's played out many times where the natural authority and capacity of local actors is displaced by something more technocratic, which fits in with a certain model of accountability.
Yeah, thank you for this. I mean, from this discussion, you see there's so many issues that are involved here. Like we're talking about trust, meeting maybe at eye level, like certain kind of partnerships. Alaistar, what you're saying, exactly, these are examples to show you that a certain practices that are dominant in the humanitarian sector are problematic in a way. And we see it going on despite this rhetoric, as you said also, Hugo, of localization. So this seems like what all of you point out is that there is this, we have to see it also as a business. It's like there are interests involved here. So despite like, maybe there's good intentions and this idea of localization as a normative thing, as Ellen pointed out at the beginning, maybe to implement it, we also have to take into account and not ignore the interests that are there, right? So when we think about the obstacles for coming to a new business model or to implementing localization, you have so many mentioned now. What do you think could be the ways forward now? I mean, we were discussing also in the previous roundtable whether localization is actually what we want. Is it the very concept, or we still have the problem of defining it, but is it what we want to push ahead with? I mean, is it the right way of going about it? And if yes, what can we do to provide incentives, or do we need more innovative ways to address the issues? And maybe I will now give the floor to whoever wants to speak first. Anyone?
I'll try if we need to get started. I mean, just to really nod and agree with the sort of political realism coming from Alaistar. And I do think that's obviously a real factor as to how much, localization is likely to succeed with those kind of political pressures. I think realistically for me, we're talking about a Western humanitarian system here. And so we're going to be largely talking about it operating in a Western sphere of influence. I think going forwards, this system's never had access to Russia, China, disasters and wars, and it won't, and probably India either. And the Islamist world as well has always been difficult. So I think where the Western system has a sphere of influence, then I think there is potential actually to get past that guy with his spreadsheet and try and change things. So that's what I would urge. And I think to do that, we probably should de-link localization from the grand bargain, actually. I mean, I think we need a few brave, courageous donors and agencies to de-link it from that, because that's going to be slow, technocratic, bureaucratic. It's going to hire new teams of localizers and require a budget for localizers, and it'll just go on with sort of Parkinson's law expanding. So I think the best thing that could happen is some courageous investors, either from some progressive donor governments or philanthropists, to set up a disruptive fund for localization and for locally led aid, which cuts out a lot of the intermediaries and really starts working, in the way that Pat and Alaistar and Ellen have described some of the, in a way, church-based networks, really leveraging that mutual aid, local aid sector on the ground already. And I think the other thing that needs to happen is that the agenda of localization is not then just about, aid donors giving away power and big international agencies giving away power, but then it must also become much more explicitly about an honest taking of that power and responsibility by national and local organizations. So the spotlight then has to shine both ways and really talk about the integrity of local structures as well. Because that's the only, that is morally right. And that's the only way that money will keep flowing. And I think, a lot of us, if I speak to a lot of people, a lot of them will say quite frankly to me, these might be people in Africa or Asia or the Middle East, they might say, look, what some of our societies like, some of our governments are like, we would much prefer, in a way, to be dealing with a sort of international, semi-international organization sometimes, because, some of our guys are just going to nick it or move it away to a different place or whatever. So I think some disruptive investors to change the game and create precedent. And I think an equal spotlight on the localizers and their integrity and commitment to their duties, as well as the rights of those to give away power.
Can I just pick up on Hugo's phrase again, sphere of influence? I think he's really helpful there with the understanding of what's the reciprocation here. And I think we've currently lost that a little bit in the UK for certain, but that confidence to feel that there's something about liberal democratic values or whatever, and the influence of that more broadly, that is part of that exchange. If there's no sense of influence, you say a sphere of influence, then what is the reciprocation of that support? And it is with a notion, or it's more defendable in the current political climate, with it supporting broader international goals of the rule of law, or the influence of democracy. And if there's quite an explicit ownership of that agenda, and there's then some functional capacity to show that these investments do support that, and support the development of local democracy, local civil society, accountability mechanisms Hugo's talking about, that's not only, in my view, hugely attractive in those states and those contexts, it's hugely attractive to a donor to feel that there are some values that are being invested in, which is of interest to the population and to that state, because that is one of the moral responsibilities of that state within the world. So I think we then have some open acknowledgement of what the reciprocation is, rather than an assumption that we can't talk about what the moral exchanges of the resource flows, if you like. And then it's a little bit more reasonable, I think, to be thinking of that aid being supporting local structures rather than driving the agenda. It's very much focused on the local.
I can maybe come in very briefly just off the back of some of the things that have been said. I thought, Hugo, your point about innovation was really interesting, because just as Alaistar said in our article, we highlight kind of how increasing accountability to UK taxpayers has kind of emphasised kind of a value for money, payment by results kind of approach to humanitarian reform. And that's kind of stifled any kind of innovation and even kind of knowledge production potentially around some of these issues. And I think that there needs to be kind of a broader understanding of how to engage with and how these processes should look with kind of a very diverse local. And that involves, you know, by kind of having that respect for kind of existing capacities at the local level includes kind of, for example, with local faith actors, recognizing that it's not kind of a magic bullet to more effective humanitarian interventions. There are challenges around engaging with local faith actors as well, for example, as well as kind of lots of opportunities, but that actually there's this kind of good of in and of itself of localization, and it's kind of a moral duty, or that there's something kind of political reasons for doing that. And I think that obviously ties into our role kind of as academics as well, kind of the production of this, promoting this agenda and kind of finding some of those technical solutions as well. And obviously, hopefully that process in and of itself, just as Pat has mentioned, should be more locally led as well, and that we should be working more systematically with, and these conversations should be being led more systematically by, you know, our partners in the Global South, or in the context that we are looking at as well.
Thank you, Ellen. This is actually, I would like to invite Pat also to say something, and I would like to couple it with Sulagna's, you know, contribution to the discussion here in the chat. And she says, just to read out, she thanks you for the interesting discussion. She says that it seems to be that there is a huge privilege in localization. Yeah? The system and powers that we have decided that localization is the way forward for geopolitical and operational reasons. Yeah? And everyone is scrambling to bandwagon. This might be the reason for the rhetorical approach to the concept. So the question is a locally led localization a utopia? And can we really have localization without accepting subsidiarity as an operating humanitarian principle? And I had to think about you, Pat, because you were working on the concept of subsidiarity in this context, right?
Yeah, and I think you're trying to set up an argument between myself and Hugo Slim here, but no. Just going back to the argument, and without sounding us all being so in agreement, I want to concur with this idea. As I said, I think that the main argument is this idea of risk, and I think Hugo is 100% right. We're going to have somebody that's going to go out there and take that risk, the calculated risk. But again, going back to the notion of new business model. I'm working with a lot of the Irish NGOs, and they play a fundamental role. There's no doubt about it in the humanitarian enterprise, and how they are going to be supported, and a recognition that the funding mechanism was geared around that old domineering approach, and how they are going to be funded and respect the value that they play in working with local partners as opposed to doing to or for them. Yeah, this notion, as Selagna talks about there, accepting subsidiarity or what we might know by, we tried to look at subsidiarity and we broke it down to the notion of trust and establishing trust and accountability and agency of local people. And I suppose we would have seen the arguments for enhanced solidarity, which never sat lightly, especially from a Dunantist perspective, but we would have seen that subsidiarity might be something that leaving the power dynamic and agency more to local people as something that maybe for the Red Cross or their other organizations to respect as part of a moving on of the principles for humanitarian action going forward.
So
I'd love to hear Hugo's reflection on that one, seeing that given his knowledge of the principles.
Well, just simply that actually I would tend to agree with Pat that I think we do need to look at them again. I mean, as you know, I don't think neutrality is a compulsory principle for humanitarianism per se. And I do think, and I'm working in a Catholic college now, I do think that, solidarity and subsidiarity, which are core Catholic values these days, do make sense in the humanitarian world. So I think if Pat was going to bang those two on the end of the other humanitarian principles, he'd get my vote.
I'm just smiling here that one of the phrases in our paper that continually got nuanced or whatever was the phrase, current understanding of the principles rather than, the principles. And I think particularly in relation to the understanding of diverse, plural local actors that who behave not as Dunantist international organizations, but as local actors with their own capacities and constituencies. But for me, that's what's most exciting about the localization agenda, is not so much national sovereignty, it's around that local capacity and just acknowledging the diversity of that. And that means that our understanding of net neutrality has to be matured. Again, if I just go to Irbid, my favorite quote from that was an Islamic organization that had not received funding because it had Islamic in the title, that said, neutral, show me your humanitarian organizations. What is humanitarianism but the garbage truck that follows failed US policy experiments in the region? And it was a very real local critique of a very privileged, somewhat strange view of what a neutral actor was in the Middle East. And they were acting in many ways hugely in concert with the principles, but were an Islamic organization, and that disqualified them as being neutral. That the presumption immediately was that they behaved in a way that was not neutral. So I think understanding the hyper-plurality of the local is both one of the exciting opportunities, but real challenges of this, because that's the key driver, I think, of that local self-determination that you're speaking of, Hugo, is not just at the national level, but is very much in terms of local civil society.
Yeah, and just to add some of that, I think kind of localization in the context of kind of the global humanitarian reform agenda, we are looking at questions about what is effective humanitarian action, who can legitimately be involved in the humanitarian sector, which inherently is broadening and changing and renegotiating what humanitarian action is and who can legitimately be involved. And so I think inherently localization as part of this kind of global humanitarian reform agenda is renegotiating and questioning some of these, what have previously been thought of as kind of tenets of humanitarian action and kind of non-negotiable. So I think that it's almost inherent in the kind of the general discussions that we're having is that the kind of humanitarian arena is changing.
Thank you so much. So maybe the audience has already noticed that we opened also the discussion already. So if you have questions, please drop them and raise them. There are, let me just see. So first of all, this is also linking to one of the comments I would have or questions I would have is Abdul Qadir Khan. He said that we can't really, as you said, there's this plurality, and can we actually go ahead without really defining who the local is and understanding who the local is? And what I also got from your discussion is, in a way, we're looking at the ones that look most like us, you know? There seems to be like, I do understand that there is maybe the need for accountability and professionalism, but do we then select, and I think that maybe goes a little bit into what Ellen said, like the legitimacy, do we select certain locals that actually already kind of do as we kind of expect them and want them to do it, like, you know, in a sense of mimicry or, you know, just being reproduction of this kind of Western organizations, let's say. So who are the locals? There's this plurality of actors that also, Hugo, you all pointed out. But can we actually move forward with the localization agenda without really addressing this issue of who's the local?
Can I just pick up on that, Kristina, again, link it a little bit to that earlier discussion, and I'll use the same NGO in Erbil as an example. That, at one level, they're not in the humanitarian system as Hugo defined it in terms of a Western funded. Much of their funding came from the Gulf or from local contributions, and its action was quite invisible to local international humanitarian coordination in Jordan. And for me, there's a challenge. I don't want to overstate the contribution of that sector, but at the very least, I think any humanitarian system that perceives to have some sort of global vision needs to acknowledge better and understand the other actors and what's operating in that instance. So they were a local actor that ultimately was deciding that going for US and EU funding was not in their interests, but they were very, very active locally and therefore not in the cluster coordination system, not bound by other principles, and yet very, very active. And it seems to me that mode of operation.
So we have people, you know, from all those different humanitarian systems, Islamic ones, Chinese, Russian, you know, whatever they are, Indian, regional AU systems. They must all be understood as part of the system we need. And it's a system of systems now. And so I would encourage us to embrace that plurality, and it won't all look like us. And we don't want it all to, you know, I think many people have rightly said localization should not just be the replication and duplication of existing Western organizations. That would be a rather dull disaster.
Maybe coming back to your innovative idea of having this disruptive, you know, maybe donor or something like sources, linking it to one of the open questions we still have here. Should we maybe introduce even some aspect of conditionality when we, you know, let's say, give the monies to local actors? So this question comes with the background of conflict settings, where we sometimes feel like if you give money and that might actually go to local actors that will harm the civilians there. So should there be an element of conditionality? And I think that links back to the debate we had on accountability, professionalism, duties and responsibilities that there should be in place. Any thoughts on this from you?
Well, just one obvious observation, picking up what Alaistar said earlier, that a lot of the money for humanitarian aid comes from countries and organizations that harm civilians. You know, if it's American, British money, the two most belligerent countries in the world, the chances are they've been, you know, harming civilians as well. So that conditionality would be very one-sided. But obviously, I think there have to be conditions. You know, this is taxpayers' money. So people should be able to say, you know, I want to make sure that there's value for money in the spend. So, you know, and I think there should be conditions on international organizations today to sort of push them towards localizing and changing their business models. So yeah, we'll give you this money if you start changing the way you work.
I do want to go on, Pat.
Pat first, and then Alaistar.
Personally, I think, and I go back to what Alaistar said earlier on as well, is whatever about a conditionality, I think that the default position should be a recognition that there's no such thing as a greenfield site when it comes to humanitarian action, that there's always somebody there already doing something, and we have to respect that we're somehow building on what local people are doing to assist and to protect their own people. And I think that has to be the default position, rather than going in and introducing some sort of an international domineering system, as we said beforehand. I personally think that in some ways the grand bargain is that conditional situation where there's targets set. And I would agree with what Hugo said before. I hope that we overcome that and even go further to putting the local as the default system, recognizing what is there, recognizing that it's going to be different. There's going to be different actors, different people, and being flexible to work with those systems.
Alaistar, you wanted to say something?
All I was going to add was, in terms of that agenda of sort of solidarity and subsidiarity, I think my optimism is in civil society mechanisms that have local, national and global links. And that's not just the base sector, but has that concertina effect that they really can be deeply rooted. But there are structures for national coordination, regional coordination, and potentially international coordination. And it seems to me that that's one of the confidences we have, not just in outside of government action, but to see that there are these linkages between the north and south, east and west, the global and the local, and it's maximizing the opportunities of the trust and the understandings that come with those structures, and it could be with trade union organizations, doesn't have to be faith-based, but that have both representation at a local level and at a global level, I think are promising ways of creating that interchange and partnership that we're talking about.
Thank you so much. We have more questions, but with a look at the time, we're actually at the end of the session, and I don't know how to wrap up here because we're in the middle of the discussion. There's so many, you know, avenues to still discuss. But I don't want to leave it just like this. I was thinking maybe we can have a last round of maybe one sentence each. What would be your vision now? I mean, we want to have innovative ways. I think we agree that localization is needed. That's at least what I hear from the discussions. Give me a vision. How should localization, what should be the next steps? What do we need? And just in a one sentence, and we all take it as food for thought for the future. Ellen, sorry for putting you on the spotlight. Would you like to start?
I will have a go. So I think that a vision for more locally led humanitarianism is around not necessarily a kind of shift of power from one category to another, but a kind of reversal of the flows of power from and decision-making power from local to national. I think a really important point that's been made multiple times today, and something that I think is really important through my kind of faith-based work, is the kind of recognition and increasing literacy around the diverse local and the existing capacity and the existing forms of kind of accountability that exist at the local level. and that there, you know, so lots of this capacity and lots of these kind of answers do already exist, if we can see them.
Fantastic, thank you. I go around as I see you on my screen. So Pat, the last sentence.
Yeah, I'd like to see the continuation on the debate around localization towards the situation where it does become the default, that we respect the fact that there's no such thing as the greenfield site situation. There's something already going on, and that has to be the starting point for how we engage to support assistance and protection going forward.
Thank you very much. Alaistar.
I look forward to engaging in this discussion with others like me, trying to step out of my secular, liberal, internationalist, multilateral, Western academic framing, where we all agree, to the diverse actors and understanding a broader vision, a broader perspective, so that we really stretch the argument and the debate.
Thank you. Hugo, you have the honor of the last words.
Well, I'm actually going to springboard off Jacob Kurtz's question for this. So he's saying, you know, how do you persuade, you know, Western taxpayers that localization is a good thing? And I think that the vision to give there is to say, look, you're going to, if you think that the two big threats ahead are, as a Western liberal, if you think they are climate emergency and increasing authoritarian governments and threats, then if you're investing in locally led national organizations, you've got a much better chance of meeting those two threats by spreading resources closer to the ground for climate emergency and continuing to imbue Western values through what in Western theory is called civil society, and therefore keeping human rights alive in organizations that care about them on the ground. So that's my attempt to answer Jake's question.
Great, thank you, and fantastic concluding remarks. I want to take the opportunity now to thank you all for your contributions today, and for the audience for listening and asking their very good questions. And let's stay in touch and continue our discussions on localization and see how things develop in future. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kristina.
And
Bye-bye.
thank you, Kristina, for a great job. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.